Hi guys, these are the skills you will need for the next lesson, which is lesson 4.2, comparing rational numbers. When I come back, we'll talk about rational numbers. But for now, you're going to need to know how to make equivalent fractions, how to compare fractions, and how to compare decimals. So we're going to go ahead and go to those prerequisite skills. The first thing you're going to need to know is how to do equivalent fractions, which I believe you learned in 6th grade. You must make the denominators the same. That would be an equivalent fraction. So if I looked here in example number 1, we have 3/4 and we have 5/6. What number can both the 4 and the 6 turn into? Or what do they have in common? And typically you want the lowest common denominator. Well, I know that 4 can turn into 12 and 6 can turn into 12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 12 here and 12 here. I want to know how can 4 turn into 12? Well, I know that I have to multiply it by 3 and that would get 12. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So 3 times 3 is 9. There's my new equivalent fraction. If I look at 5/6 and I'm turning it into a fraction with a denominator of 12, I need to say, okay, well, how does 6 turn into 12? Oh, well, if I multiply it by 2, whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So 5 times 2 is 10. So what I've done in example 1 is I've turned 3/4 into a equivalent fraction, 9/12, and I've done the same with 5/6, turned it into 10/12. So now we're going to look at example number 2, okay? So we have these two fractions, 5/8 and 1/4. They need to have a common denominator. So my question here that I pose is what number can both 8 and 4 turn into? Or what do they have in common? Well, I know both these numbers can turn into 24. So I'm going to write that down. Okay? Now, I need to know, well, how do I turn 8 into 24? Well, I know 8 times 3 becomes 24. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So my numerator is 5 times 3 is going to be 15. That is my equivalent fraction. And then I'll do the same on this side. 4 goes into 24 by multiplying it by 6. I must do that to the top. This is my equivalent fraction. So you've learned the first skill, creating equivalent fractions or fractions with common denominators. So if I were to say then which fraction, 3/7 or 2/3 is greater, you would have to do that first prerequisite skill, meaning I can't compare these two fractions until I create an equivalent fraction or common denominators. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well 7 and 3, I need to turn those into a common denominator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a fraction line here. Well, 7 and 3, what they have in common is they can both turn into 21. 7 can turn into 21 by multiplying it times 3. And you would do the same to the numerator, and that becomes 9. So here's my equivalent fraction. I'm going to do the same thing here. 3 goes into 21 7 times. I do the same to the top number, which gives me 14. So now I can compare those fractions because they have common denominators. So from that, I'll say, well, is 9/21 bigger or is 14/21 bigger? And right away, I know that 14 is bigger, so I would say that 9/21 is less than 14/21. Okay? So you have the skills in your tool belt now to create equivalent fractions, and then you would compare them. The last skill you're going to need to know how to do is to compare decimals. Okay? When we compare decimals, I believe the most important thing to remember is that you're going to use zeros as placeholders. Let me move that back over. Okay? You're going to use those zeros as placeholders. So for example, if I had the decimals 0 and 15 hundredths, or I had 0 and 81 hundredths, right away you can easily say that, well, 15 hundredths is smaller than 81 hundredths. So you don't need to worry about the zeros. But let me give you another example which sometimes throws people off. If I had a number like 2/10, or I had 21 hundredths. Some of you get confused with this because I have one place value here and two place values here. Well, I would simply add a placeholder 0. So now it's easier to compare. I have 20 hundredths or I have 21 hundredths. Well, which one is bigger? 21 hundredths. Let's do one more example. Let's say I had 0.58 and I had 0.6. Again, it's kind of hard. Many of you have a hard time visualizing this and comparing them. This has 2 decimal points. This has 1. What I would do is add a placeholder 0. Now it's easier to compare. I have 58 hundredths or 60 hundredths. So right away, I know that 60 is bigger than 58. So those are the prerequisite skills to help you with Lesson 4-2. Today you're going to practice these skills.